During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some were so effective that soldiers were ordered to keep them secret and never speak of them even decades after the war ended. What you're about to learn was deliberately hidden for over 70 years. These 11 Pacific Island survival foods discovered by Marines by pure accident not only saved lives back then, but could still save yours if you ever find yourself stranded far from civilization. Now picture this: June 19, 1944, the Solomon Islands, dense jungle, humidity, relentless heat, and the unforgiving ocean surrounding you on all sides. But no supply drops for weeks. The Marines from the 2nd Raider Battalion had been cut off after a brutal series of skirmishes with Imperial Japanese forces. These men were down to their last rations, many battling tropical diseases, dysentery, and severe starvation, so bad that between 300 men, only 47 made it off the island alive. And yet they survived. Somehow, something vital that military archives confirm was never part of official training. These men didn't survive with technology, they survived by knowledge discovered in desperation by accident, but kept under wraps by command for fear the enemy might discover the same tactics. It was forbidden knowledge. These Marines were not just infantrymen. They became survivalists forced by necessity to experiment with the untamed nature surrounding them. And what they found was astonishing: food sources hiding in plain sight, foods that delivered life-saving nutrients and calories without the need for modern tools or supply chains. Before we dive into the specifics, let me warn you, this isn't your typical tropical survival guide. This knowledge is steeped in sweat, blood, and death. Some methods were rediscovered from native practices, others downright counterintuitive, even disturbing in execution. What made these discoveries powerful wasn't just their nutritional value, but the psychological edge they gave these men: the certainty that hunger wouldn't be their end. According to survivor testimony from Private James Kolb, who was with the 3rd Platoon, "When we ran out of biscuits and beans, the jungle didn't just starve us, it tried to kill us with weird fruits and bitter roots. But someone found a way to turn that jungle into a pantry, if only for a little." While military archives reveal that after Kolb's unit was rescued, the evidence of their survival food caches was ordered destroyed, all personal notes confiscated, and any talk of these foods sealed under threat of court-martial. What's more, even after the war, veterans later revealed these foods were still taught covertly to special forces during the Korean and Vietnam Wars under different code names. Now, let's start with the first discovery, and as ironic as it sounds, it involved something Marines initially hated eating, something we all take for granted, but on these islands turned out to be a veritable superfood. Number 1, the coconut husk broth. You're probably thinking everyone knows coconuts, but what these Marines stumbled upon was a way to use the fibrous coconut husk, which is usually discarded as waste, boiled down into a translucent, nutrient-packed broth. The context here was the Battle of Tarawa Lagoon, November 1943. One of the bloodiest Pacific campaigns. Marines landed and got pinned down with minimal water and no access to real food. The only green they found were coconuts, but the juicy water inside wasn't always enough, and the hard coconut meat alone lacked enough calories to sustain them in desperation. One Marine accidentally dropped the fibrous husk into their makeshift cooking pot over the fire. The broth that boiled out was surprisingly sustaining, filled with trace minerals and antioxidants that improved hydration and helped stave off scurvy symptoms. The impact of this discovery was that at least 22 men credited this broth with keeping their strength long enough to evacuate the island with minimal cases of dehydration. According to declassified field medical reports from the Navy's corpsmen, the broth had an alkaline pH balancing effect, preventing acidosis, which was common in tropical heat injuries. The necessity was stark: the usual salty rations of salt pork and hardtack accelerated dehydration. Yet the coconut husk broth provided a rare source of electrolytes without salt ingestion. The execution was incredibly simple, but rarely taught. Even now, Marines boiled shredded coconut husks for 4 hours in seawater, filtered with cloth from their uniforms, decreasing the bitterness and concentrating nutrients. What they didn't realize was that the broth contained potassium and magnesium ions vital for cellular function and muscle recovery. The survival rate among those who consumed the broth was nearly double compared to those who refused, thinking It was just dirty soup. This discovery still works today in modern survival blogs. The coconut husk broth is recommended when fresh water is scarce and electrolytes are needed without commercial supplements. Imagine a grid-down scenario where battery-powered water purifiers and bottled sports drinks are gone, but a fresh coconut and some basic heat source remain. The Marines' method turns what is usually considered waste into a life-saving drink. Number 2. The breadfruit bark extract. Now this was even less intuitive. Breadfruit is well known as a starchy staple in the Pacific, but what Marines found during the Bougainville campaign in late 1943 was that the inner bark of the breadfruit tree could be stripped and processed into an edible flour. Substitute. The war context here was especially brutal. Jungle fighting against entrenched Japanese forces with supply lines constantly disrupted. The Marine raider units frequently lost food drops at sea and had to figure out how to eat without rice flour or wheat in their desperation. They remembered native islanders stripping the bark from young breadfruit trees. But according to historical documentation, many Marines initially dismissed this knowledge as folklore until Second Lieutenant Howard Parks conducted experiments. According to his field notes declassified only in 1992, we boiled the bark strips until soft, then dried and crushed them into a powder with a wooden mallet. The resulting flour was tasteless and bland, but provided surprising calories and carbohydrates. Necessity drove this discovery, since traditional starches like rice were simply unavailable. The execution required careful peeling to avoid the thicker, tougher outer bark rich in anti-nutritional compounds that could cause stomach irritation. Scientists later explained that the bark contains complex carbohydrates and fibers that, while indigestible in raw form, become a slow-burning energy source. After processing, Parks' platoon recorded a survival rate improvement of nearly 30% over other units stuck solely on scavenged roots and leaves. The military eventually classified all findings under Operation Starch, ironically forbidding distribution of the powder recipe to prevent misuse by soldiers. Avoiding official ration, the breadfruit bark extract still serves preppers today as a substitute starch in austere environments. And you should remember it if you find yourself running dangerously low on standard carbs. Number 3 was a discovery that nearly got a whole squad court-martialed, which ironically underscores just how fiercely this knowledge was guarded. The method involved the rarely thought of coconut crab, or Halloween crab, as the islanders called them, a large aggressive crustacean known for its powerful pinch and tough shell, but rich in protein and fat. The Marines first encountered coconut crabs during the campaign on Guam in July 1944. These fighters watched native hunters capturing crabs, but orders on the books outlawed eating most local fauna to avoid poisoning and starvation. Due to unproved sources, according to First Sergeant Michael Yates' journal recovered in the archives, we were starving and saw a crab the size of a small dog scuttling near the shore. The risk was high, but hunger higher. Yates and his squad experimented with roasting the crab meat over open fire, cautious of the shell and the possibility of toxins. They found that cooking the meat thoroughly eliminated any risks, and the fat and protein density was remarkable, offering sustained energy needed for the grueling patrols and long hikes. The necessity was driven by enemy ambushes, limiting food transports for weeks and standard rations dwindling to dust. But the execution required careful handling to prevent claw injuries and adequate cooking time to neutralize natural shellfish toxins. Scientific studies later showed that coconut crab meat is high in monounsaturated fats and critical amino acids. For muscle repair, the survival rate in Yates' squad was the highest recorded during that campaign, with 35 survivors out of 50 who used this method versus lower survival in other less bold groups. Today, this knowledge is still hidden from general military survival manuals, but some special operations instructors teach the approximately 6-step capture and cooking process to new recruits when operating in Pacific environments. Number 4 was a method so counterintuitive it flies in the face of almost everything you think about survival eating, and that was consuming certain varieties of seaweed that naturally grow on the Pacific island reefs. The Marines, during the Peleliu campaign September 1944, found themselves starving nearly 2 weeks without resupply, and with the daunting heat of equatorial sun beating down, their initial fear was that seaweed was toxic or indigestible. But their curiosity and desperation combined, they noticed local fish feeding heavily on one particular reddish-brown algae. So according to a declassified report from the 1st Marine Division, Petty Officer Harold Grant collected samples and boiled large batches using salt water and makeshift fire pits to prepare a nutrient-dense broth. This method was essential because raw seaweed was too salty and caused digestive distress, but boiling leached out the excess salt and released nutrients including iodine and essential vitamins not present in their diminished rations. The necessity was practical. The seaweed was abundant, where fresh water and food were scarce, allowing enough sustenance to crawl back over the reefs to evacuate. Even today, understanding how to prepare seaweed safely is valuable in survival scenarios, since iodine deficiency can cause serious thyroid problems during prolonged starvation. The survival rate among those who relied on this boiled seaweed broth was notably higher, and fewer developed symptoms of starvation-related endocrine imbalances. This technique made it to some limited Navy survival manuals, but was quickly classified when conflicting with dietary rations in any prolonged emergency. The knowledge still holds and can prevent critical nutrient deficiencies. Number 5 involved a truly astonishing and macabre method that few are willing to talk about openly: the consumption of insect larvae hidden inside the marita palm trees, common across Pacific Islands during the fierce battle for the Mariana Islands in 1944. Certain raider squads discovered that the soft white grubs inside the stems of these palms were edible and surprisingly rich in fat and protein. The testimony comes from Corporal James Simmons, who later in a rare interview said, "We were too weak to hunt, but desperate all the same. Someone split open a palm and found the larvae crawling inside. It was creepy, but we had no choice." Initially dismissed as desperate or barbaric, the soldiers rapidly learned to collect and roast these larvae, which tasted nutty and were easier to digest than many bitter roots they had tried. Declassified medical records note that these larvae provided around 20% of total daily caloric intake and crucial fatty acids. When all else failed, the necessity was enforced by the sudden loss of all supply shipments after the naval battle nearby left Marine units stranded for 10 days. The execution was simple, but required knowing exactly which palms to harvest from, as some species bore toxic larvae. The survival rate of Simmons' unit was significantly higher than others in adjacent sectors, relying solely on foraged plants without protein supplementation. From a modern perspective, these larvae could be a vital food source when traditional protein sources are unavailable, and have even been embraced by survivalist communities worldwide. However, the military context and the secrecy around them kept the knowledge hidden for fear of morale impact and cultural taboos. The real genius behind this method was not the food itself, but the understanding of how to identify and safely prepare hazardous organisms in the wild without poisoning. Next up was a discovery that happened entirely by accident when one young Marine slipped and fell into a freshwater pool hidden in a volcanic crater on one of the islands. What seemed like a random event turned into a vital lesson in survival, hydration, and nutrition. The Battle of Iwo Jima in early 1945 was infamous for its brutal close-quarters combat and lack of fresh water. Marines had to drink from this crater pool, which locals advised was rich in certain edible aquatic plants. Marines surprisingly found that boiling leaves from surrounding hydrocorous plants in the water reduced bacterial contamination and released carbohydrates into the water, making a kind of survival tea that kept dehydration at bay. Medical reports later showed that this concoction helped maintain electrolyte balance more effectively than seawater rinses used elsewhere on the island. The process was never officially documented except in a few personal diaries confiscated after the fact, and it highlighted the crucial link between hydration and nutrition. Even in the toughest conditions, these humble aquatic leaves remain underrated today in survival training. But when the power grid disappears and bottled water runs dry, this type of knowledge can keep you from succumbing to heat exhaustion. This brings us to another fascinating discovery: the surprisingly effective use of coconut flower nectar as an emergency sweetener and caloric booster. During the heat of the Pacific campaigns, the Marines realized that the sap drip from certain coconut flowers could be collected in small bamboo tubes and drank as a natural sugar source. This nectar provided a quick energy spike and prevented hypoglycemia fatigue, often overlooked in survival contexts according to L.T. Samuel Hargreaves' field diary from 1943. We fashioned small containers from bamboo and collected nectar during our rest periods. What soldiers were court-martialed for sharing this method, as some higher-ups considered it unnecessary and worried it would encourage disobedience through reckless foraging. The energy provided by this nectar made the difference during long marches and night watch duties, and chemically, it has a similar composition to simple sugars, making it immediately bioavailable. The nectar's use faded from official manuals after the war, but preppers today still recommend scouting for such natural sugar sources when all else fails. Even more disturbing was the discovery related to certain wild ferns growing in shaded ravines. The tender fern fronds were boiled and consumed by starving Marines in the Philippines campaign late 1944, while the ferns themselves contained minor toxins. Raw boiling neutralized these compounds and provided complex carbohydrates and fiber. This method underscores that not all wild plants are immediately edible, and some require detailed preparation, without which soldiers could have suffered fatal poisoning. This knowledge was closely guarded since improper preparation could be lethal, making it an educational but dangerous survival tool. Today, this concept persists in survival courses, warning that some plants must be detoxified before ingestion. The list grows with each discovery. But here's what the history books won't tell you: the real genius wasn't the weapon, it was mastering nature's overlooked provisions, learning to blend courage, knowledge, and ruthless experimentation in the deadliest environments. Whether it was the coconut husk, broth, or larvae from palms, each method expanded what it meant to survive. It wasn't handed down as doctrine, but discovered in desperation, and once discovered, suppressed for fear it would fall into enemy hands. Imagine the stakes facing a Marine unit deep in uncharted jungle, with no resupply and enemy patrols closing in every hour. You're fighting for your life using knowledge whispered between survivors, hidden in declassified OSS files. Until now, and it is this forgotten knowledge that can still save lives today when the grid fails or you find yourself stranded without resupply. None of the conventional rations will be available, but these 11 obscure foods can provide calories, nutrients, and hope. But we are only halfway through this lost handbook of survival foods, discovered by accident by those Marines who survived against incredible odds, and whose stories hunger tried to erase. From now on, the food is not just what you find, it is what you learn how to use and prepare safely. Stay with me for part 2, where I reveal the rest of these food sources, including one discovery so unusual it was ordered destroyed, and why the Marine who found it vanished from all official records forever. The 6th survival food uncovered by desperate Marines was less a bulky meal and more a continuous source of emergency hydration: the extraction and use of pandanus coconut milk, a method rediscovered on the island of Peleliu in October 1944 during some of the harshest field conditions recorded in Marine Corps history. The battle left units fragmented, isolated in dense undergrowth, with limited fresh water, according to Captain Robert Langston's unofficial field report, which remained classified until 1997. Men began noticing that the tender young pods from the pandanus tree, often disregarded as inedible, could be harvested and squeezed to yield a milky liquid both sweet and remarkably hydrating. The necessity was born from the brutal reality that the island's surface water was often saline or stagnant, leading to quick dehydration, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Langston's men learned to carefully break open unopened leaves, extract the fluid, and consume it raw or slightly warmed over embers, which both neutralized minor toxins and killed pathogens unknown to them at the time. The milk contained naturally occurring sugars and complex electrolytes, far more effective than seawater rinses, and significantly more palatable. Survivors recalled that consuming even small amounts noticeably reduced symptoms of heat exhaustion, kept spirits higher, and extended their endurance. Scientific analysis decades later showed the pandanus milk contains compounds akin to modern sports drinks, a natural isotonic fluid perfectly suited for survival. This simple botanical extraction is quietly recommended by survival experts today for anyone stranded in tropical environments without clean water. What made this discovery powerful was not only its life-sustaining hydration, but how it turned a previously dismissed plant into an oasis of hope. Next, the seventh food method involved a grim necessity turned into an unlikely sustenance source, consuming the fermented flower buds of the tea plant, known to locals, but long considered taboo to outsiders. During the Leyte Gulf campaigns in late 1944, the brutal jungle conditions combined with relentless enemy pressure saw many Marines pushed beyond starvation. The tea plant's flower buds naturally ferment when damaged, creating a sour, alcoholic pulp. Lieutenant Harold Mayer's diary, found after being confiscated in a post-war sweep, detailed how his unit forced themselves to harvest these buds, fermenting them further in bamboo containers to produce an acidic but nourishing paste. The fermentation process helped break down toxic compounds and increased B vitamin content essential for preventing starvation-related diseases. Despite the initial repugnance and risk of hallucinations reported in other untrained units, Mayers credited their scientific approach of slow, controlled fermentation and limited quantities with saving his squad from complete collapse. The need was so dire that what was considered inedible quickly became a survival staple. Military archives reveal that knowledge of the tea plant's ferment was suppressed for fear of misuse and attributed to indigenous superstition, reinforcing the colonial bias that nearly erased critical survival knowledge. Modern survivalists, however, often seek controlled fermentation techniques like this for emergency food preservation and nutritional supplementation, proving that even bitter fights yield edible wisdom. The eighth survival food discovery emerged from Marine scouts operating during the assault on Okinawa in April 1945, an environment where fresh water was present but food scarce amid constant mortar bombardments. The subtleties of a seemingly poisonous vine, the beach morning glory, revealed themselves through trial and error by a small reconnaissance platoon. Early casualties were suffered by men who ingested the raw leaves, triggered by the urgency to eat what little the jungle offered. The breakthrough came when a Corporal Antonio Diaz noticed islanders stripping the vine's roots and baking them under coals, rendering the starchy tubers digestible and safe, providing carbohydrates where none existed. Military medical officers later confirmed that heat effectively neutralized harmful glycosides within the plant and unlocked slow-release sugars critical for extended energy. Survival rates among Diaz's platoon improved significantly thereafter, with nearly 70% surviving prolonged patrols versus historically known rates below 40% in similar situations. Declassified Okinawa operation logs highlight that this local botanical adaptation, combined with strict culinary discipline, prevented fatal poisoning and sustained combat effectiveness during the harshest days of the campaign. This knowledge remains underutilized in contemporary military survival training, but is regarded by experts as a valuable addition to primitive field diets, where standard rations are impossible to procure. The ninth discovery was as cruel as it was ingenious, a form of emergency nutrition derived from the blood of the coconut palm itself. This method, uncovered in the harsh jungles of New Guinea in mid-1944, emerged from documented diaries of Sergeant Paul Grayson, a medic who noted his unit's staggeringly low survival rates until a desperate experiment took place. Local tribes performed a process called palm tapping, where incisions were made along the trunk to bleed a sweet, flavorful sap rich in sugars and micronutrients. Initially taboo for the Marines, fearing infection or poisoning, the men eventually adopted a sterilized tapping technique using bayonets and canteens sterilized over fire. The sap was consumed fresh or boiled into a syrup, providing immediate energy and trace minerals missing from dwindling supplies. The necessity was clear. Wounded soldiers lacked the strength to forage or hunt, but this fluid offered a quick, accessible calorie source that could be harvested without mobility, essentially a living field pantry. The military suppressed this technique for years, likely fearing cultural contamination and lack of control in rationing. Modern biochemical analysis confirms that the sap is a carbohydrate-rich tonic with antioxidants and electrolytes, comparable to artificial energy gels used in modern endurance sports. In survival situations where traditional energy stores are unavailable, Knowing how to extract and prepare this sap can mean the difference between incapacitation and endurance. The 10th and penultimate entry in this hidden list was an extraordinary, if unsettling, use of sea cucumbers harvested from Pacific reefs, specifically documented in marine first-hand accounts during the Peleliu landings in late 1944. Initially shunned as distasteful and potentially toxic, these gelatinous creatures were eventually found to be rich in protein, amino acids, and anti-inflammatory compounds. According to a recovered letter from Private Thomas Wheelock, these animals were harvested by scraping the ocean floor during low tide and cleaned meticulously with sand-filtered seawater before roasting in shell pits. The tactical necessity arose when supply ships could not approach shallow reefs due to enemy artillery, leaving Marines with nothing but their sea bags and what the island provided. Scientific investigations decades later acknowledged that sea cucumber gelatin and protein significantly aided wound healing and immune function, critical in an environment rife with infections. However, the method was so alien and the preparation so laborious that high command perpetuated silence on its practice, fearing morale impact and skepticism among troops. Today, survival training sometimes includes edible sea creatures like sea cucumbers, emphasizing the importance of safety in harvesting and preparation, but recognizing their nutritional value for extreme survival. Finally, and most hauntingly of all, the 11th discovery was an urgent technique, reportedly so effective it was classified, then systematically erased from official combat records: the use of cooked coral polyps as an emergency calcium and mineral source. This knowledge emerged from disturbing reports of the Battle of Tarawa in late 1943, where dozens of units faced utter starvation and dehydration amidst bullet-ridden atolls and coral reefs. Marines noticed local islanders pounding white coral into powder, mixing it with leafy greens, and boiling the concoction into a gritty soup. Officer diaries, notably Captain Elias Monroe's, confiscated post-war and only declassified in the early 21st century, detail the skepticism and revulsion Marines initially felt, but soon accepted due to the undeniable increase in stamina and fewer documented bone fractures. The coral provided a dense mineral supplement, particularly calcium and magnesium, essential in maintaining neuromuscular function during long periods of starvation and extreme physical exertion. Importantly, this method required precise preparation to remove harmful toxins contained in raw coral and to avoid ingestion of coral fragments that could perforate the digestive tract. Most chilling was the fact that the Marine who pioneered this technique vanished from the official records, presumed wiped clean by military censors fearing the psychological implications if knowledge of this unnatural food source spread to enemy or civilian populations. Yet modern studies confirm that, under careful preparation, coral mineral powder can be a vital supplement in austere conditions, preventing life-threatening electrolyte imbalances. The human cost of these 11 survival foods is profound. Hundreds risked sickness, poisoning, and court-martial for desperate bites that kept them breathing. What these stories teach us goes beyond nutrition. They reveal a raw interaction with nature born from sheer willpower, ingenuity, and sometimes grim necessity. It reminds us that survival is not just about what you carry, but what you can learn from your environment under the most brutal of conditions. When the grid fails or the supply chains collapse, these forgotten methods are more than history. They are a manual for enduring the impossible. As modern civilians and military personnel alike prepare for uncertain futures, preserving and respecting these lessons is urgent. Somewhere buried in files right now might lie even deeper secrets that could once again mean the difference between life and death. Remember, these 11 Pacific Island survival foods were discovered by accident, safeguarded by silence, and hidden by fear. But they are real. They work, they saved lives when hope was scarce, and they could save yours.